There's something strange happening in and around Mount Shasta. Hikers have been going missing, people have reported strange lights in the sky, but most disturbingly are the stories that park personnel and hikers alike have experienced over the years in and around this mountain. In today's episode, I'm going to share with you 3 disturbing stories that will make you rethink exploring the wilderness of Mount Shasta. You won't want to miss this one. In 2016, Phil Prescott and a couple of his close friends decided that they would go on a weekend camping trip right around the Mount Shasta area. Now, Phil was the kind of guy who just loved the great outdoors, and he loved spending a lot of his time out in nature whenever he could. And so this was going to be a fantastic getaway with his friends, and especially during this time too, because Phil had just gotten over a really bad breakup with a longtime girlfriend, and so he really just needed a weekend to forget about everything and to spend the time in nature that would provide him with the solace and peace of mind. And so on a Friday afternoon, him and his buddies, they throw all their equipment, tents, everything they would need into the bed of a truck, and they get ready to head out to the campsite. And as they're doing this, the one friend is suggesting to Phil that there's a particular trail that he really wanted to go down because he hadn't had a chance to do it yet. And that is the Bunny Flat to Panther Meadow Trail, which, by the way, is like roughly 7 miles long and takes you through this incredibly scenic and beautiful section. And so Phil agreed with his friends that it sounded like a great idea. And because Phil has also hiked around the Mount Shasta area before, but had not actually gone on this trail yet because it's one of the more popular. And they all realized this could potentially be a lot of fun. Now, their plan was initially to stay until Sunday afternoon when they would return home because Phil had to be back at work by Monday morning. He was an insurance agent and his boss wasn't exactly a fan of him being late. And so they set off and they arrived at camp just before dusk. And so after the boys got all finished setting up and they got their tent up and they got a roaring fire going, they're just talking about how excited they are about the day's events to come. And they're really, really excited to explore this particular section of the trail and just maybe get a chance to do some backcountry hiking in the following day. And in fact, when they had gone last fall, this section of the mountain that they were in was actually closed off, so they were really looking forward to it. And so as the night progressed and it got later and later, they would decide to retire to their tents, very eager for the next morning. Now, as the sun rose for the following day, they got up, got all their belongings together, and they started heading down the Bunny Flat to Panther Meadow Trail. And so, as they're going, and they get right about to the 2-mile point, give or take, and Phil's friend notices that there's not really a whole lot of other people on the trail, which he then tells to Phil that he found it very strange because this trail is like one of the most popular trails there were. In fact, they hadn't seen a single soul since they had got on the trail. Now, normally, there's a lot of hikers going up and down it during this time of year. It's not exactly abandoned or closed off by any stretch of the means. So they just think it's very strange. But, they keep going. And as they continue to make their way, Phil and his friends notice that everything around them is eerily still. And you can almost hear a pin drop. And it's this very unsettling silence. And one of Phil's friends at some point begins to stop the group and he's like, guys, listen, just listen. And they heard this strange noise. And far in the distance, they begin to hear this tribal drumming. But it had this ethereal quality to it, and it would kind of move around from their north to their south and even all around them, above them and below them. It didn't seem like the sound had any specific direction or source. And at first they're thinking like, well, maybe there's a powwow going on. They weren't really sure, but there's just something that Phil would remark about that the sound made it really unsettling. It was a feeling like they were hearing something that they weren't supposed to be hearing. And so at one point or another, as they just continue to make their way further down the trail, despite all the strange feelings that they've been having, they decide to go ahead and take a rest at this little fallen log that's kind of right off the side of the trail. And that's around them. And this part of the trail, it kind of widens up and it kind of dips down below, so you could basically see off to the left and the right of you. And directly behind them where they're sitting is kind of this larger meadow that kind of just dips down and opens up more. And, they're just sitting there having conversation, just making remarks about the strange experiences of the day, and more specifically, what they're excited to do, because not everything has to be doom and gloom, right? And also how much farther they want to go on this loop. And as soon as one of the friends stands up to turn to face the meadow, he just kind of stops and freezes there, and he's like, guys? And in response, they all kind of just stand up, turn around, and he points out in the meadow in the clearing, and all of them could clearly see what looks like this shimmering light. It's almost kind of like a rippling in the air, and it's kind of weaving back and forth, and they're looking at it, and they're looking at each other like, what is this? Like, what are we looking at? And so Phil and his friends just got this really, really intense feeling of dread wash over them, like they weren't supposed to be there, that they needed to turn back now. Also, keep in mind that, and literally at this point, they still had not seen a single soul on the trail. It was as if it was completely abandoned, that they were just by themselves. It was already very, very off-putting. And so Phil was starting to feel like, maybe he's had enough hiking just for right now, and maybe it would be a good idea to turn back to camp and maybe just rest for a little while before they do anything else. And so again, at this point, they were maybe no more than 3 miles at most, and so they all agreed, and they turned to head off back to camp. Now, interestingly, as they're doing this, they start to notice all the sounds of the woods start coming back. I mean, they start to notice the birds chirping, they could hear animals and squirrels, and just the noise of the forest. And probably the strangest thing of all, hikers. Hikers not only traveling in their direction as if they've come out of nowhere, but also coming up and down the path passing them. Now, this was very strange considering the trail had just been completely dead the entire time, and now it seemed like it was suddenly alive with hikers. And they all thought this was very odd considering that for the past 3 miles, they didn't see a single sign of anybody. And so they weren't really sure how to explain this sudden resurgence of hikers. And so they get back to camp and they just kind of kept talking about the day and how weird it was and that it was really strange and off-putting. And so eventually they kind of just keep doing what they're doing and hanging out, and they go on a couple more hikes around the area. And the evening comes by, and they decide that they want to turn in early tonight to get a head start for tomorrow, because today was very weird and they just want to go and have a really good hike before they have to leave Sunday night. And so as everybody goes into bed because it's late, Phil had a really hard time falling asleep. After all of his buddies had passed out, he just kept tossing and turning and having these strange nervous bouts and these weird knots in his stomach that he just couldn't explain. And he explained that it was very off-putting, and he kind of just laid there and felt like something was wrong. And maybe not necessarily that they were in danger, but just that something wasn't right. And so at one point or another, he's kind of just drifting off into sleep finally, and he's awakened because he hears this strange clicking noise. Now, it's not necessarily right by his camp, but it's also not too far away either, and he estimated that it was probably no more than 70 yards away to his 3 o'clock. And he could hear this strange kind of chirping clicking sound, and he said it reminded him of a large cicada, but it was different. It sounded different. It didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard before. And he would kind of like come in and out of it as he was kind of coming in and out of sleep. And the sound he would notice as he was doing this was kind of fading away and getting closer and moving and just doing some weird things. And it really bothered him because he couldn't make out what animal or insect it was coming from, but it was far too loud to be just an insect. So anyway, he eventually falls asleep. And so the following morning, he gets up and his buddies were like, "Did you hear what happened last night?" And of course he's like, "No, like what are you talking about?" And so they began explaining to him that they had heard somebody walking around their campsite, but they thought it was Phil. And they're looking down now and they can see these strange prints in the ground near their tent. Now, to make a quick note here, the ground in which they were at was more solid than wet, so the prints were pretty faint and they couldn't be made out very well, but enough that they could see that something was there, and it was what appeared to be large, 3-toed bipedal tracks. Now, they're trying to sit there and explain it thinking like, well, maybe it was a bear, maybe it was a person, but regardless, It off-put them enough that they couldn't exactly tell what it was or who it came from. And with everything else that had happened during this trip, it was enough for them to say, peace out, we're done, this is too weird. I mean, and already it was early Sunday morning, so they were already planning on leaving late Sunday night, so it's not like they really missed out on too much. So they just decided to pack it up early and head back. Now, interestingly, Phil also had a lot of close friends who were very involved in their indigenous roots, whether being full-blooded native or just partly because of the area that he lived in, which was Siskiyou County. And it wasn't until after this experience that he learned that there was just a lot of weird stuff happening and had happened around the Mount Shasta area in general. And not just from indigenous tales and lore, but even just from other strange stories and hiking experiences that other people have had. In particular, there's supposedly the city of Lemuria that exists deep within the mountain itself. People have reported insectoid humanoid beings like, humanoid praying mantis, just stuff that would blow your mind and make you think you were in a science fiction novel. Now, as far as the strange rippling they saw in the meadow, why it seemed as if they had almost walked into another dimension where there was nobody else around them to only have everybody reappear again, and the strange clicking noise they heard, and the footprints that were found outside their tent, that all, folks, remains a mystery. As we talked about in the last story, there supposedly exists a city deep within Mount Shasta that is the city of Lemuria. And it is supposedly ran by these ancient pale-skinned Nordic alien beings, or maybe I should say interdimensional beings. And they have this entire city carved out of crystal and possess technology far beyond our third dimensional comprehension. Well, a 24-year-old girl by the name of Harmony had an experience that she believes dealt with one of these things back in the summer of 2011. So Harmony was just hiking around the Mount Shasta area, and one morning she got up early, packed her Jeep full, and decided to just drive around and kind of find a great spot to pull off and just walk along a section of forest. Now, Harmony was kind of one of those rougher, tougher girls. She didn't really exactly enjoy following the trails and markers. She enjoyed the rugged backcountry. This was a woman who'd grown up with nothing but brothers. Her parents were ranchers, so she had done a lot of hard labor in her life and just a lot of outplaying in the woods and just that kind of lifestyle. And this was the terrain she loved. It was her terrain. She loved the backcountry. She loved being in the woods. And on this particular day, she just pulled over on one of the many back roads around Mount Shasta, because there's a bunch of them, and just decided that this would be a great spot just to get her backpack on and maybe just do a couple hours worth of hiking, just walking around, exploring, seeing what she could find. Of course, she had come prepared. She had a compass, she had all the essentials. She was not stupid. She knew very well what a person needed to be prepared going off into the wilderness. She had informed her family of where she was going, what time she would be back, all of the essentials of what you need to do when you go out into the woods for safety. Now, she was probably no more than maybe about 2 or so hours at most, because the sun was just starting to barely crest over the horizon to signal that it was becoming dusk. And she comes upon this little cliff area where she notices what she could see was a very tall man standing by the cliffside, maybe no more than 100 yards away at most, and he's kind of off in the distance, but his back is to her. And normally this wouldn't be off-putting, but you have to consider two things. First off, he's extremely tall and wearing strange robes or clothing that she's never seen before. And he has very, very, very long white hair. And not to mention they're like several miles away from any trail, so things were a little weird. And so she's thinking like, okay, maybe I'll go ask him if he needs help or if he's okay, but it just seemed odd that he was just standing there by himself, his back turned, and just looking out over the cliff. And she decided to approach him to see if maybe he needs help. And so as she gets closer, she calls out to him, "Hey, my name's Harmony. I've just been hiking in this area. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" This man didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge that she was yelling to him. And so she's like, okay, this is weird. And so she decides to get a little closer. Maybe he didn't hear me. And she gets a little bit closer and she calls out again, "Hey, my name is Harmony. Are you okay? Did you not hear me? I've been hiking this area. Do you need anything? Is there anything wrong?" And still, he did not acknowledge her or respond to her. And at this point, she's probably no more than maybe 50 yards away from this person, and all of a sudden she stops and feels this strange electrical sensation come over her entire body. It wasn't exactly paralysis, but it was enough to, it felt like a magnetic force kind of come over her, enough that it stunned her for a second or so, and she's thinking to herself, like, what on earth is going on? This is really weird. And actually, it was very much like, you know how when you take a balloon and rub it all over your hair, you just kind of have like that static sensation? That's basically what it was. And she described that next was something straight out of an X-Files episode, that this person never turned around, but that they spoke to her telepathically. And that's the only way she can think of it, because she had heard a voice and words coming into her head that were not her own, but were very clear and discernible. And it spoke to her and said to her in a strange accent that, child, there are things you must know about the world that will soon come, but now is not the time. And as soon as that sentence finished in her head, this bright light flashes and the person was gone. Now, whoever this man or person was, well, she wasn't really sure, and so she was just kind of awestruck and surprised because she had no way to explain what the heck had just happened. Like, was she having some sort of mental breakdown? Was she hallucinating? And so in her stunned freak out, she's kind of like, you know what? I don't really know what that was. Maybe I'm not well. I need to get back to the car. And she takes about another hour or two just before it's starting to get dark, gets back to her Jeep, gets in, turns it on, and she begins to notice this strange, I don't want to say ringing sound, but it was this strange high frequency noise that would kind of like come and go in her head for the next several days, and she had no way to explain it. Obviously, just living around the area, especially in Siskiyou County, the tale of Lemurians isn't exactly unknown. But she would actually not say anything about this story for a very long time until around 2020, just because she felt people would either think she was crazy or that she would lose her job. And she actually held a place of influence in the place where she worked at the time. And so she didn't want to come off as some new age crackpot. She just decided to keep the story to herself until it was appropriate to talk about it, or never. Now, unfortunately, the strange man with the strange robe and long white hair and the telepathic message that he sent to her and just the entire experience, well, it all remains inconclusive. In 2009, Bo and his girlfriend had decided to go and camp during the week in late July at one of the more popular campgrounds around Mount Shasta, the McBride Springs Campground to be exact. And so Bo and his woman had planned for an incredible 4-day venture here because Bo was fortunate enough to be able to get the time off work to make this happen. And his girlfriend was quite the hiker, let me tell you. So something I want to make a quick note of is that the campground itself, it is a beautiful, secluded spot just nestled in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. It's surrounded by pines and situated along the banks of creeks. Now, the campground itself has a dozen or so very well-maintained sites, each equipped with picnic tables and a fire ring, and just really like ideal for summer evenings when you want to roast marshmallows and look under the stars, and so this was the perfect getaway. Now, Bo and his girlfriend arrived at the campground on a warm Monday afternoon, and they were ready to set up their tent and to begin exploring the surrounding wilderness. And so as they drove into the campground, they actually noticed that it wasn't as full as it usually was, which was incredible for them since they'd have a lot more privacy. Now, once they got into their campsite, they began to quickly set things up, and within just an hour or two, they were all ready to go. And after this, the two decided to have a quick lunch of hot dogs and beef jerky that they had packed, and figured a great way to stretch the old legs would be to go on a hike and just get a good feel for the area. Now, Bo and his girlfriend hadn't actually been to this campground before, or this area at all, so they were very excited to go exploring. And the two of them walked to one of the nearest trailheads when his girlfriend got the idea. She's like, hey, instead of us just going on the trailhead, we should totally just venture off and maybe just explore for a few miles and see what we might find. You know, we have a compass, we have a full cell service, so getting back should be no problem at all. And Bo's girlfriend had a really good photographic memory as well, so her confidence in their ability to get back to the campground was very high. And so, of course, Bo, being completely confident in his girlfriend's abilities, just went along with it, and he let her lead the way. and so off into the wilderness they went. Now, after about an hour or so of really taking their time and just enjoying the beauty of the Mount Shasta wilderness, they decided to stop at a large rock near a small creek in a clearing to just rest and enjoy the nature around them and chit-chat. And as they sat there just taking in the surroundings, Bo couldn't help but feel uneasy. He wasn't sure why. And so he glanced over at his girlfriend, who seemed kind of just lost in thought, and her eyes were kind of just watching the flowing water of the creek. It was beautiful, by the way. Bo had asked his girlfriend if she noticed anything strange or out of place. And so, she would look at him with a confused expression because she's like, what do you mean? And he just kept shrugging, thinking like, I don't know. I just had this weird feeling that I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. And so they kind of just sat there in silence for a minute. And Bo still had this feeling that he just didn't really know what to make of it. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, that there was just this heaviness, this stillness in the air. And so he's like, well, I'm looking around. I don't see anything that's out of place, but I don't know. This doesn't make any sense to me. And almost immediately, this odor wafted into his face, and he just almost felt like vomiting. And within a second, his girlfriend smelled it too. And like now they're looking around for the source, and they're like, what on earth is this? And so after like a couple seconds of looking around and not seeing anything, Bo stops and looks up and makes a horrific discovery. Slung over a large branch, maybe no more than 30-40 feet above them on a pine tree nearby, was a dead deer. Or should I say, what was left of it. The head and front legs had been ripped off of it, with the body just slung on the branch like someone had put it there for later. And judging by the smell and the looks of the decomposing deer, it was probably days old, maybe no more than 3 at most. But oddly enough, there didn't appear to be any flies or any sign of decay or anything eating on it. It was very weird considering it was a hot day, and both Bo and his girlfriend had already been at this spot for maybe 15 minutes, and at this point, neither of them really smelt it until just now. I mean, it was windy, but not to the extent that it would have kept them from smelling it right away. And so Bo and his girlfriend decide that now was a good time to head back, and that maybe to be safer, they should just hop on a nearby trail to curve their way back around to the campsite, because the way that they went was pretty rugged, and it had taken them a little bit. Now, not to mention, Bo didn't bring enough water with them, so obviously that's an issue. Now, fortunately, Bo's girlfriend knew where the trail was, and it seemed to be just beyond a thicket of trees just ahead, just beyond the small creek. And so the two of them got up, they made their way over the creek and around this thicket, where Bo, leading this time, actually stopped mid-step, because what was previously concealed by trees and brush were now fully visible to Bo and his girlfriend. There in a small pile were easily 5 to 6 deer heads. Not cleanly severed either. They were, by what they observed, ripped off, judging by the way the flesh looked and how it appeared torn and tattered, and each head was missing the eyes. The heads appeared no older than 24 hours at most, and now Bo and his girlfriend are just getting this really bad feeling like there's something wrong. Something bad is happening. Someone or something is out here doing this, and they're getting panicked and worked up. And so a few more moments goes by, and they kind of collect themselves, and enough to where they're able to get back on the trail, which took about another 20 or so minutes. And as they do this, they notice that the forest had actually been completely quiet. It felt very out of place. Bo especially was freaking out, thinking they're being followed. And as they got back near where the campsite was, they both started talking to one of the rangers there and just telling him what they found, and that it was very concerning to find. And the ranger just had this look on his face like he knew very well what it was, but couldn't say anything. In fact, all he told them was that he was going to look into it, that everything would be fine, don't worry about it. Well, fortunately, they were able to make their way back to their campsite without anything happening. And the rest of the evening, well, they just couldn't stop thinking about it. And they kept talking about why somebody would leave deer heads, and none of it really made any sense to them at all. Even stranger to these two was the way the ranger acted when they told him about what they found. It didn't feel genuine. It felt rehearsed. Well, as the night got later and the two retired to bed, Bo woke up in the middle of the night having to pee really bad, and as he's getting ready to unzip his tent, he stops mid-pull because he could hear something. It's very faint, but it's starting to get a little louder, and he can now hear it clearly, and he starts shaking because of what he's hearing. And so he just lets go of the zipper and dives back into his sleeping bag, grabbing his knife for protection. He was so terrified that he no longer had to pee. Well, eventually he must have passed out from exhaustion because his girlfriend is waking him up in the morning, and he immediately starts panicking, and he's telling her, "We have to leave now, we're not safe here." And she's trying to calm him down because she's like, "What are you talking about?" And he's getting hysterical. And he explained to her that late last night, as he was getting ready to leave the tent to go pee, he heard his girlfriend's voice whispering to him, calling his name out from the woods for him to come here. She wants to show him something, and that she had called him by name. And obviously, his girlfriend had no idea how to explain it, but it definitely creeped her out. And so they decide maybe they should just pack up and find a different campground. And so they get up, they pack up real quickly, and they start to head out of the campground. And on their way out, they actually see the ranger from the previous day. And so Bo pulls over real quick, gets out of his car, and goes and talks to him. And, he explains to him, last night I was trying to sleep, and I heard someone who knew my name whispering to me that sounded like my girlfriend. And there's somebody out here killing deer. You might have a serial killer or something. You need to take care of this. And then the ranger's demeanor changed, and he got really mean and nasty and begins just yelling at Bo about yesterday, and that how dare they go off on a unmarked trail, and that it's extremely dangerous, and that there are mountain lions and bears, and it's very easy to get lost. In fact, he became so enraged that he ended their interaction with asking them to leave the campsite. Now, obviously, Bo thought this response and the entire interaction was very, very strange. And so him and his girlfriend left, never came back to the McBride Springs campground, but later that afternoon, they would find a spot miles and miles away where they would spend the rest of their vacation without any strange incidents. The person or thing behind the dead deer hung up in the tree, the pile of freshly decapitated deer heads, and the park ranger's odd responses and behavior, unfortunately, remains a mystery. And because you guys have made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment down below Mount Shasta conspiracy. So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy this kind of storytelling, like where we get into the details and it feels cinematic like you're in the story, then you need to slap that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.